I rented a ground-floor flat in a small residential building on the edge of town. There were only 4 units in total, 2 downstairs, 2 upstairs. The kind of place where people stayed to themselves and didn't ask questions. The walls weren't paper thin, but they carried sound more than you'd expect. Doors closing, footsteps, chairs scraping, that sort of thing. About a month after I moved in, the flat next to mine was rented out to a family. I watched them unload their car from my kitchen window. A man and a woman both looked tired in a way that didn't seem work-related. They had 2 kids with them, a boy and a girl. The kids stood close together while the parents moved boxes inside. Neither of them spoke. They didn't wander. They didn't touch anything. I remember thinking they were unusually quiet. For the first few days, I didn't notice much. People came and went. Doors opened and closed. Normal apartment noise. But after a week or so, something became hard to ignore. The kids never went outside. Not once. I work from home, so I'm around during the day. I'd see other families in the building come and go. Parents leaving for work, kids being walked to school, weekends with bikes leaning against walls and shoes left by the entrance. The kids next door stayed inside. Their curtains were always drawn. Morning, afternoon, evening, it didn't matter. No backpacks, no school runs, no toys, no noise that sounded like play. At first, I assumed they were homeschooled or sick, or that maybe I was just missing them. I wasn't actively watching, it was just something I started to notice without trying. Then, the nighttime sounds started. Late at night, usually after midnight, I'd hear movement through the shared wall. Not loud, just enough to register. The sound of feet crossing the living room, furniture shifting slightly, sometimes the kids crying. It wasn't screaming or tantrums, it was quiet crying, the kind that stops suddenly when someone speaks. The father's voice came through occasionally, calm, low, even. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it wasn't shouting. That, somehow, made it worse. The mother's voice was almost never audible. One night, around 1 a.m., I heard the kids moving around for a long time, back and forth, back and forth. Then, a sound I couldn't place at first. Scraping. Not fast, not aggressive. Slow scraping along the floor. It lasted several minutes. The next day, I saw the mother in the hallway for the first time since they moved in. She was taking rubbish out. Her face looked drained, like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. I made small talk and asked how the kids were settling in. She paused before answering. "They're adjusting," she said. That was it. As she turned to leave, I noticed something else. Faint marks on her wrist. Small, circular bruises. Not fresh enough to look alarming on their own, but noticeable. Over the next week, the sounds got more specific. At night, I started hearing what sounded like furniture being moved into the same place repeatedly. A heavy object dragged across the floor, then dragged back. Always late, always slow. One night, the crying went on longer than usual. Then, it stopped, abruptly. The following morning, I noticed the windows in the kids' bedroom for the first time. The curtains were open just enough to see the glass. There were locks on the outside. Not child safety latches, metal locks, installed high enough that a child couldn't reach them from inside. I stood there longer than I should have. That afternoon, I called the non-emergency police line. I didn't accuse anyone of anything, I just described what I'd noticed. The lack of school, the nighttime sounds, the locks. They said they'd log it and send someone by to check. 2 days later, there was a knock on my door. It was an officer. He asked a few questions, then he went next door. I didn't hear much. A door opening, some talking, then silence. That night, the flat next door was quiet. No footsteps, no scraping, no crying. The following morning, the family was gone. No boxes, no furniture being moved, no car outside, just an empty space where their vehicle had been. The flat stayed empty for weeks. About a month later, a maintenance worker came by to inspect the unit. He knocked on my door first, asking if I'd noticed any leaks or smells coming from next door. When I said no, he hesitated. "They found a room," he said. I asked what he meant. He told me there was a section of the flat that didn't appear on the building plans, a space that had been sealed off behind a false wall. No windows, no ventilation. The floor was scratched badly. The kids' bedroom, he said, hadn't been their bedroom at all. They'd been kept upstairs. He didn't say anything else. A few weeks later, I moved out. The first time I realized he was obsessed with the property line, it didn't feel like anything serious. We had just moved into a quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was tidy, uneventful, with families who waved politely but kept to themselves. Our new neighbor, Mr. Harwood, was a retired surveyor. At least that's what he told me the day I introduced myself. He was an older man, thin, precise, with a polite but almost mechanical smile. At first he seemed harmless, friendly even, occasionally waving from his driveway. But almost immediately I noticed his routine. He spent hours in his yard, pacing the boundaries of his property. He tapped stakes into the ground at regular intervals, measuring with a long steel tape, taking photographs of the fences and corners. It seemed odd, but he explained that he was just keeping records from his surveying days. We didn't think much of it, until he started measuring hours. It began subtly. I'd be in the garden, trimming a bush, and notice him at the edge of his yard, crouched behind a stake with a clipboard, taking notes as if he were recording the exact position of my flower beds. One afternoon, I caught him photographing the shadows of our roof. He looked up, smiled politely, and said, "Just making sure everything is aligned with local bylaws. You understand, don't you?" I nodded, thinking it was harmless, maybe a quirk of someone who had been a surveyor his whole life. Then came the first act of trespass. I woke one morning to find that the old oak tree in our front yard, planted by the previous owners, a beautiful tree that had been there for decades, was cut down. Just gone. The stump remained, hollowed out like a coffin. I ran outside to see Mr. Harwood standing calmly at the edge of his driveway, hands folded behind his back, watching me. "I'm sorry," he said when I asked what happened. "It was over the line, by 2 inches. Technically, that tree was on my property." I stared at him, incredulous. "You cut it down? Without asking?" He shrugged, eerily calm. "It's a legal boundary, you understand, right? Local bylaws. I can show you the measurements." He produced a thick binder filled with photos, diagrams, and notes. There were pictures of my driveway, my garage, my family moving around our yard, everything meticulously documented as if he had been waiting for some minor infraction to happen. I was shocked, angry even, but he remained polite, calm, and precise. Every argument I made he countered with exact sections of local property law, page numbers, and citations.
That was the first day I realized this wasn't just a quirk, it was an obsession. Weeks passed. His obsession escalated. I noticed stakes he had driven into our yard overnight, markers that weren't there before. Photos taped to the fence posts, showing angles of our backyard from vantage points I didn't think anyone could reach. He had binoculars mounted near the second-story window of his garage, aimed at our kitchen and living room. The first truly terrifying moment came when I noticed a package had gone missing. A small delivery, nothing of real value, but gone nonetheless. At first, I thought it had been stolen, but then I noticed something odd. The mailman's slip had been altered, the tracking code scratched out, and next to it, a stake I hadn't seen before, carefully pressed into the ground, measuring the corner of our driveway. I started feeling watched constantly. The street was quiet, but I could see him pacing the boundaries at odd hours. Sometimes he would be in his yard, sometimes across the street, measuring, photographing, or scribbling in a notebook. Every action I made felt scrutinized. Every word I muttered outside could be cataloged. One afternoon, I confronted him. "Why are you doing this? This is my property." He smiled. "Oh, I'm just making sure everything is aligned. Your property, my property. Lines are important. Airspace counts too, you know. That shadow your roof casts on my lawn for 3 hours a day, technically that belongs to me. You understand, right?" I didn't, but I nodded anyway, feeling a creeping sense of unease. The final revelation came unexpectedly. I had been digging around the stump of the oak tree he had cut down. At first, I was just curious, wondering if there had been anything left behind. What I found made my stomach drop. Inside the hollowed stump was a small hidden camera aimed directly toward our bathroom window. A lens no bigger than a coin, carefully concealed, pointed at a room where only our family could be. My hands shook as I realized the extent of his obsession. It wasn't just about property lines or legal quirks. He had been watching, recording, cataloging. I checked social media later that day and found his profile. He belonged to an online group called Extreme Property Rights. Members argued obsessively about ownership of airspace, shadows, and even the rights to light and wind on neighboring properties. Mr. Harwood wasn't just a retired surveyor with quirks. He was part of a community that encouraged invasive obsession. The sense of violation was overwhelming. I felt unsafe in my own home. Every step I took outside, every window I opened, every movement in my yard felt like it could be documented. I called the police, explained everything. The stakes, the photos, the camera in the tree stump. They came, inspected the site, and told me that unless he had physically trespassed or stolen something, there was little they could do. He hadn't technically broken the law. I couldn't sleep for nights. I installed my own cameras, changed my blinds, blocked sight lines, but the fear lingered. The quiet obsession of someone who could intrude psychologically without touching a thing is terrifying in ways words can't describe. Eventually, Mr. Harwood moved out. He didn't leave a note, didn't apologize. The house was empty one morning, just as meticulous and quiet as before. But the sense of unease never went away. I still check the windows at night. I still feel like someone is watching from angles I can't see. Every time I pass a neighbor with binoculars, I flinch. And I know, somewhere out there, someone could be cataloging my life in the same obsessive way, hiding in plain sight, and still be perfectly legal.